Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Africa in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, historian, journalist, podcast and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of Africa in Focus, it's a roundup of the just gone AFCON 2025 that saw Senegal be crowned African champions. We can tell you, if it was a success and how the final went and how we thought the teams who we picked went as well. So that's the thing for this week's podcast, a roundup of AFCON 2025. So before we get to the show, if you like what you hear, please share it with your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube. Hit the notification bell, meaning that YouTube will notify you every time we upload a new podcast. We're also on Spotify. Look out for Ghana African Focus on Spotify. Hit the follow button, meaning that Spotify will notify you every time a new podcast is downloaded. All right, and if you still want to do business in Ghana, you want to know about the Ghana card, want to know about how to get a phone contract, want to know about citizenship, then we do offer a consulting service where we charge $30 an hour or £25 for a half-hour briefing session, whereby we can tailor make a package for you based on what your requirements are, based on what your needs and wants are. So I've got more than 10 years of experience of doing business in Ghana, so I know the terrain, know about land issues, know how to get land, know what to look out for, where the good properties, etc. So I'll leave you my email address in the fullness to the show if you'd like to book a conversation with myself. And if you want to donate to the show, we accept donations in kind to help us with the show, to keep on producing some more fantastic content for you coming out of Ghana, coming out of Africa. You can click the donate button or support button, and I will leave that link on the fullness to the show. Okay, so let's get into the podcast, looking at the just ended Afrika Cup of Nations, AFCON 2025, and describing how a great success it was. So before we get to that point, so obviously Senegal won the Afrika Cup of Nations last week, defeating the host Morocco 1-0 in a very, very hotly contested final. So I told you that before the tournament, I said that Morocco were my favorites and they should at least make the final, which they did. I also told that Senegal, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and also Algeria had very good chances of also making it through to the latter stages. Obviously, Algeria were not at the quarterfinal stage, but Nigeria made the semifinals where they lost to Morocco. And Ivory Coast also made the quarterfinal where they lost to Egypt. Okay, Egypt also were another one of my fans into also. So we did pretty well in terms of advising you who would make the latter stages. We also did pretty well advising you who would come out of the group stages and make the knockout round. So this AFCON has been proved in terms of the big boys turned up, in Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Senegal. All the big boys turned up and made the latter stages of the tournament. Yeah, and the tournament was, despite a couple of issues, the tournament as a whole was a success as compared to La Côte d'Ivoire, but in some areas, as opposed to not to some areas, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So it tells you that the big boys turning up, and the games are very, very competitive as well, particularly some of the big games like the Nigeria Morocco game, like the South Africa Cameroon game, like the Ivory Coast Egypt game. So these games were very, very well, very, very high quality and well contested. And it shows you that African football is developing leaps and bounds, with obviously many of the continent's big stars plying their trade in Europe, and also the Saudi Premier League, which is a very competitive league. You know, the Saudi League is not to be sniffed at. It is a very, very competitive league. So a lot of South African players are playing in some of the best leagues in the world. And this is shown in the quality of football that was played at the recent Afrika Cup of Nations. And so before we get to the final itself, just to give some, bits about, why this AFCON was more of a success. So in terms of the numbers, then, we could say that this AFCON was better than Ivory Coast. So if you look at the numbers, the early attendance, were half full. So the early games had low turnouts and muted crowds. And this was confirmed by multiple, reports. Yeah, but overall attendance in Morocco was higher compared to Ivory Coast. So, for example, by match day 2, Morocco had already hit more than 500,000 fans across 9 stadiums, an average of 21,167 per match. That was higher than Ivory Coast at the same stage. So, despite the half-full stadiums being a rarity early on, as the latter part of the tournament came to a crescendo, particularly after the knockout stages, i.e. the quarterfinals and semi-finals, the full stadium became to be the norm, yeah? And obviously the final was sold out. Now, in terms of atmosphere, it was different. So the atmosphere, was kind of subdued. It was not like proper African, but let's not forget, the culture is different. North Africa has a different football culture than, say, West Africa. So, for example, many coaches and analysts, including South Africa's Hugo Bruce, publicly criticized the subdued atmosphere in Morocco. He described it as lacking the street-level buzz and fan energy that defined Gabon and Ivory Coast. Yeah. So there's a reason for why you could say, the energy and the vibration was lacking in Morocco as compared to La Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. So Morocco is quite far from most African fan bases. So for example, if you're coming from Ghana, Nigeria, the Gambia, it's about a 5-hour flight, which is not too bad. Senegal as well. But if you're coming from somewhere like, Zimbabwe, they qualified. South Africa, they qualified. Uganda, they qualified. Tanzania qualified. That is a long, long way. That's about at least a good 8-10-hour flight from this country. So Morocco is very, very north of Africa compared to like South Africa, which is the southernmost point of the continent. So that at least is a 10-hour flight. And then Zimbabwe as well is quite south. And then, in the east, you've got Uganda and Tanzania, who also qualified for the AFCON. So those places are very, very far from Morocco. So this is why you could say that there was not much of a vibe in Morocco compared to Côte d'Ivoire. And also, as we know, traveling around Africa is very, very expensive. It's not like Europe where you can get a flight, say, from London to Amsterdam or London to Paris for less than £100. Yeah. Or from London to Rome, London to Berlin for about the same price. And if you look at different providers like Skyscanner, that's even cheaper. You can get flights to Europe from the UK for between 25, 30, 40 pounds. However, traveling from one African country to another is very, very expensive. So that deterred many Africans in other parts of the continent making a trip to Morocco. And also, the local fan culture was strong for Moroccan games, but not as intense for the other fixtures. The games that featured countries like, Burkina Faso, Mali, to an extent Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda. These games were not as intense in terms of the fan base as opposed to Morocco and even opposed to Algeria, which is next door, Tunisia, which is next door, and also Egypt just about a couple of hours flight. So those games that defeated Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia, yeah, were very, very packed because a lot of the quote unquote locals, I'd rather say Arabs, in those countries made a short journey to Morocco. Yeah. Now, in terms of, comparing to West Africa has a more naturally spontaneous vibe, and that was, you could say, a reality in 2023 when Cote d'Ivoire had more packed fan zones, it had more street celebrations, fans were traveling by road, i.e., from Ghana, from Nigeria, from Senegal, from, Liberia, traveling by road to La Cote d'Ivoire, and had a more kind of African vibe to it. It was loud, it was emotional, yeah? But Morocco didn't have that. It was more like as if you're watching a match in the Premiership or La Liga or Bundesliga. It didn't have that African, finesse to it or the African vibe to it. Yeah. So, overall, was Morocco better than Ivory Coast in terms of attendance? Yes, it was. The numbers in Morocco outperformed Ivory Coast. In terms of atmosphere, Ivory Coast was much, much better. There was more passion, more noise, and more Pan-African energy than there was in Morocco. And if you judge by African fans supporting their teams, Morocco had early struggles with turnout, but overall, Africans were showing up just differently. And also culture and geography also shaped the vibe as to, in terms of how many Africans were, able to come up from different parts of Africa to support their teams in Morocco. So all in all, the tournament was a success in terms of the venues, in terms of the audiences, and the venues were actually world-class venues, compared to what was, even Ivory Coast was pretty good. But I think the venues in Morocco and the infrastructure was on another level compared to Ivory Coast. So it tells you that, if governments are prepared to invest like Morocco has done, Morocco has deliberately invested in football infrastructure over the last 10 years. And obviously the proof of the pudding is what we saw in AFCON 2025, the great stadium with great pitches, and the pitches held out, even though most of the time, it was played in the torrential rain, the pitches held up and the facilities were first class. So that should serve as a wake-up call and a reminder to other African countries that if we deliberately invest in football infrastructure, in football stadia, etc., then, you're guaranteed a fantastic tournament. Now let's get on to the final itself, where, Senegal beat Morocco 1-0. Some would say in controversial circumstances. That's the European media. And you remember what I told you before the tournament? That the European media have their narrative. They want to rubbish everything that's African and, rubbish our institutions. Unfortunately, because of the incident that happened in the final, when Senegal walked off the pitch for about a quarter of an hour, because Morocco was awarded a penalty just a minute after Senegal had a legitimate goal ruled out for, play infringement or what have you. Yeah. And on that note, in some quarters, some say the officiating was very, very bad. Some say the officiating was good. So you take a pick on that. But, I'm not going to reduce, 15 minutes, right, where Senegal had legitimate cause to walk off the pitch to shatter the whole tournament. No, I'm not going to do that. The Western media can do that, but we here on African Fix are not going to do that. Senegal did what they felt was in their interest to do by walking off the pitch in terms of, they not being treated in the same way as Morocco was in terms of a fair contest. So if they had a legitimately got a fair goal ruled out, and Morocco had a very, very dubious penalty awarded to them, which is why you could understand how and why most of the Senegal players walked off. Now, for the European media to actually rubbish that, for me, is hypocrisy, because there's a lot of, things wrong with European football, particularly anti-black racism in all of European, countries, whether it's Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Croatia, England, Germany, Holland, Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal. Anti-black racism is rife, yeah? And African footballers get insulted every day of the week playing football in Europe, but yet FIFA and Gianni Infantino don't say anything about that. However, they want to come and talk their bull crap about the 15 minutes of Senegal's protest and the legitimate protest, to that degree. So for me, what I'll say to that is that Senegal had a legitimate right to walk off the pitch because they had concerns about the officiating. But for me, more importantly, what Senegal did was an act of psychological warfare. Yeah? And we all know that Morocco did some psychological warfare before the final. But let's even get into that, because that's not even talked about even in the African media. Because we know that during the semi-final with Nigeria, there was a lot of anti-black racism. In actual fact, there's been a lot of anti-black racism throughout the tournament. That's something that's not being reported by, definitely being reported by the European media, and also definitely being reported by African media. But for what we gather, what we know, there was a lot of anti-African racial abuse, particularly when, the so-called Arab teams, so-called Arab played African teams. So, for example, when Egypt played Cote d'Ivoire, there was some anti-African abuse. And we definitely know that when Nigeria played Morocco in the semi-final, there was a lot of abuse, particularly when it came to the penalties. There was a lot of abuse, anti-African abuse, and even monkey charts, aimed at the Nigerian players. Yeah, and even at the final, we know that before the final, Senegal were not happy with the hotel that they were in, and also some of the you could say, for want of better word, conditions within the facilities of the hotel where Senegal was on the eve of the final. So all these were part of Morocco's plan to try and win the AFCON by any means necessary, by trying to destabilize the opposition. Yeah? So this is what they did, but when it goes against them, then they want to cry foul. So for me, even though I tipped Morocco to win the tournament, yeah, and they got to the final but didn't win, in a way I'm happy they didn't win, because of the anti-African, anti-black racism that their supporters espoused to African football fans who attended some of the games. So for me, you reap what you sow, and karma has come back to bite Morocco. So Morocco, we all saw what happened when they made the semi-final of the World Cup in Qatar 2022. They said that they're not African, they're Arab. Yeah. And we all know that Morocco is not part of the African Union because of the situation in the Western Sahara. And they've openly made an attempt to join the European Union. But because the European Union is for Europeans and Moroccans aren't Europeans, the European Union has turned down Morocco's application to join the European Union. So this is where Morocco is at. So even though they're on the African continent, geographically, right, and they're still an African country, the Arabs stole an African country, the same way that Europeans stole Namibia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana, Kenya, etc. The same way Arab people stole Morocco, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria. Yeah. And so they say they're Africans. Yeah, but live in African soil. So for me, karma got Morocco. and you reap what you sow. And so I'm happy in a way that Senegal won the Africa Cup of Nations, because really and truly, right, proper Africa won it, not fake Africa. Yeah. We know there's Africans, indigenous Africans in Morocco, but they make up about 20%. No, yeah, but they make up 20% of the population of Morocco. And they get blatant anti-African abuse every day of the week. I remember I did about a couple of years ago. No, 23. I did a podcast about anti-African racism in Tunisia. Yeah. The same anti-African racism is going on in Morocco towards Black people, African people, indigenous African people. So you reap what you sow, and I'm happy that Morocco, did not win the AFCON. And it hurts because they invested a lot of money, resources, and time and effort into wanting to win the AFCON. Because Morocco's never won the AFCON apart from 1976. So they wanted to win this one really, really bad. And so you could tell it hurt when you saw the players come up for their medal, when you saw the King of Morocco, when you saw the reactions of the Moroccan fans. They were hurt, yeah? And not to serve you right, for the anti-Black racism that you espouse on African people in Morocco. And so, I'm not going to say anything more about the AFCON. Suffice to say that, the best team won. Senegal are a very, very powerful team. And we're looking forward to the World Cup, because a lot of the big teams are going to represent Africa. Your Senegal, your Ivory Coast, your Ghana, your Morocco, your Nigeria. I'm not giving it a day. It's very, very strange, because Nigeria, for me, played a very, very good tournament, and they were looking not to beat Morocco in 9-10 minutes, and they went to penalties, and penalties is lottery. You can easily miss a penalty. So Nigeria should be proud of themselves, and they should give the Malian coach Eric Chelle. They shouldn't sack him. They should continue with Eric Chelle, and qualify for the next AFCON, which is next year, 2027, and that's going to be held in East Africa, namely Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. It promises to be a very, very interesting tournament there. But also get Nigeria to qualify for the 2030 World Cup as well, which is going to be held in Morocco, Portugal, and Spain. So Nigeria have got the basis of a very, very good, vibrant team, and so the Nigerian coach should not be sacked by the Nigerian Football Federation. So, like I said, it was a great, great tournament. Some great football was played. Some very, very interesting matchups, and some very, very interesting results. And African football is growing all the time, and it's coming of age. And particularly when our top players are playing, in Europe and also inside the league, it can only bode well for the future of African football. All right, so that's my take on the AFCON. If you like what you hear, please share to your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Fix on YouTube. Subscribe to Ghana African Fix on Spotify. All right, in next week's show, we're going to talk about Ghana and gold, and why Ghana should be getting more leverage from gold, as gold is hitting record prices. All right, so for myself, Kwame, and from all the crew here on Africa in Focus, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next edition of Ghana Africa in Focus.